Have you ever felt a sudden wave of inadequacy after sharing good news with someone close to you? Noticed how their smiles seem forced, their congratulations hollow? In that uncomfortable moment, you're encountering the shadow of jealousy as Carl Jung understood it. Not merely an emotion, but a powerful psychological force that operates largely beyond conscious awareness. Jealousy exists in all of us to varying degrees. It emerges when we confront in others what we desire yet deny within ourselves. Success, confidence, connection, freedom, authenticity. But Jung recognized that its most destructive forms aren't always obvious or acknowledged. The friend who subtly undermines your confidence, the partner who can't celebrate your independence, the colleague who judges your ambition. These individuals aren't typically conscious of their jealousy. Instead, as Jung would explain, they've relegated these uncomfortable feelings to their shadow. Where unacknowledged, these emotions gain power and manifest through projection and other psychological mechanisms. In works like the archetypes and the collective unconscious and psychological types, Jung established frameworks for understanding how our unconscious content shapes our relationships. He taught that what remains unconscious doesn't simply disappear. It finds expression through our behavior, often in ways that create psychological entanglements with others. The person who cannot acknowledge their own jealousy becomes possessed by it, projecting this disowned emotion onto those around them. This exploration delves into 5 psychological profiles where unconscious jealousy operates as Jung might have analyzed them. These aren't simply toxic people to avoid. They represent complex psychological patterns that affect both the individual and those in their orbit. By recognizing these dynamics, we gain insight not only into challenging relationships, but also into aspects of ourselves that may require integration. As we examine each profile, remember Jung's ultimate message: awareness creates possibility. By bringing these unconscious patterns into the light of consciousness, we liberate ourselves from their grip and open pathways to more authentic connections. The journey begins with recognition. Number 5, the shadow projector. Imagine sharing exciting news. Perhaps a promotion you've worked toward for years, a creative project finally gaining recognition, or a personal achievement that fills you with pride. Most friends would match your enthusiasm with genuine celebration, but the shadow projector responds differently. Well, I guess some people have all the luck. Must be nice having the right connections. Their words carry an undercurrent of resentment, subtly implying your success comes from favorable circumstances rather than merit. At first, you brush these comments aside, but over time, a pattern emerges. They consistently find ways to diminish your achievements. They respond to your good news with thinly veiled bitterness. After these interactions, your joy feels tainted. You find yourself downplaying accomplishments around them, even questioning whether you truly deserve your success. Jung's concept of projection illuminates this dynamic perfectly. In the archetypes and the collective unconscious, he wrote, "Everything that is unconscious in ourselves, we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly." The shadow projector has disowned aspects of their own: ambition, desire for recognition, capacity for achievement. Rather than acknowledging these parts of themselves, they've relegated them to the shadow, that repository of characteristics we refuse to recognize as our own. When confronted with your success, they experience an uncomfortable emotional response: envy that triggers shame, inadequacy, failure. Instead of recognizing these feelings as internal signals pointing toward their own unfulfilled potential, they project them outward. In their psychological reality, your achievement becomes the source of their discomfort rather than the mirror reflecting their unintegrated aspirations. This projection creates what Jung called a hook between you and them, an unconscious entanglement where their disowned psychological content attaches itself to your experience. The danger lies in how easily their projection can become your psychological burden. You begin carrying their unacknowledged feelings, questioning your worthiness, feeling responsible for their emotional response, modifying your behavior to avoid triggering their discomfort. In Ion, Jung noted that projections change the world into the replica of one's unknown face. The shadow projector doesn't see you or your achievements accurately. They see the distorted reflection of their own denied potential. Their jealousy isn't actually about you. It's about the parts of themselves they cannot bear to confront directly. What makes this dynamic particularly insidious is how reasonable their responses often seem on the surface. They don't openly attack you. They simply offer perspective or reality checks. These gradually erode your confidence and joy. Over time, you might find yourself anticipating their deflating responses, hesitating to share good news, inadvertently allowing their projection to limit your self-expression. To protect yourself psychologically, Jung would likely recommend conscious differentiation. The process of distinguishing between what belongs to you and what belongs to them. When they respond to your success with subtle resentment, practice internal awareness. This reaction reflects their struggle, not my worth. This boundary allows you to maintain authentic pride in your achievements without absorbing their projected inadequacy. Creating this psychological separation doesn't necessarily require confrontation or ending the relationship. Jung believed that conscious awareness itself transforms dynamics. By recognizing projection when it occurs, you can maintain compassion for their struggle while refusing to carry what isn't yours. Their jealousy remains their psychological work to address, regardless of whether they choose to undertake it. If you recognize these shadow projections in your own relationships, or perhaps in yourself, you're beginning to see the unconscious patterns Jung devoted his life to uncovering. Subscribe now to continue this journey of psychological insight. Number 4, the comparative rival. The comparative rival transforms every interaction into a contest you never agreed to enter. Share an experience, and they immediately counter with something better. Mention training for your first 10K race, and they'll casually reference the marathon they completed last year with barely any training. Describe a challenging work project, and they'll detail how they handled something more difficult with apparent ease. Even your struggles become opportunities for their one-upmanship. Your difficult day prompts their story of overcoming far worse circumstances. Initially, you might interpret their behavior as enthusiasm for shared interests or simple conversational reciprocity. But eventually the pattern reveals itself. They consistently position themselves above you in an invisible hierarchy. Conversations feel less like exchanges and more like competitions, where they must emerge superior. This dynamic illustrates what Jung called archetypal possession, when a universal pattern from the collective unconscious dominates an individual's behavior. In the archetypes and the collective unconscious, Jung described archetypes as primordial images inherited by all humans, psychological templates that shape our perceptions and behaviors. While everyone carries the potential for these patterns, some individuals become overtaken by particular archetypal energies. The comparative rival has been possessed by what we might call the rival archetype, a competitive energy that transforms relationships into battlegrounds for superiority. Their constant comparisons reflect an inner landscape where self-worth comes only through favorable comparison with others. Rather than establishing intrinsic value, they measure themselves against external benchmarks, which means your achievements become threats to their precarious sense of self. Jung wrote in Psychological Types about how unconscious complexes can create compulsive behavioral patterns. The comparative rival's jealousy manifests not through direct resentment, but through this compulsion to outdo you. They can't simply witness your experience. They must immediately assert their dominance. This soothes their unconscious insecurity. Their behavior stems from what Jung would identify as a scarcity mindset, a belief that there isn't enough recognition, success, or value to go around. In their psychological reality, your gain represents their loss, creating an unconscious zero-sum game where every interaction becomes transactional. The psychological danger here lies in how this dynamic subtly reshapes your own mindset. Through repeated exposure to their comparative framework, you begin viewing your experiences through a competitive lens. Activities once pursued for intrinsic enjoyment become measured against external standards. Accomplishments once valued for personal growth become evaluated by relative status. This shift represents what Jung calls identification with the archetype, which means being pulled into the same unconscious pattern that possesses them. To maintain psychological autonomy, practice what Jung termed active imagination, consciously engaging with archetypal content rather than being passively controlled by it. When faced with their competitive energy, internally acknowledge the pattern. I recognize this competitive dynamic, but I choose not to participate. Mentally step outside the invisible contest, returning to your intrinsic experience. My journey has value, independent of comparison. This psychological stance doesn't require confronting them directly or withdrawing from the relationship entirely. Instead, it establishes an internal boundary that prevents their archetypal possession from spreading to you. You can interact with them while maintaining your autonomous relationship to your own experiences, achievements, and challenges. Number 3, the covert saboteur. The covert saboteur undermines your confidence and momentum through subtle discouragement disguised as concern. When you share an exciting new venture, perhaps a business idea, creative project, or personal goal, they respond with seemingly thoughtful cautions. That sounds ambitious. Have you considered all the risks? I'm just worried you might be disappointed like that time before. They position themselves as protective voices of reason while planting seeds of doubt that take root in your mind. What makes this dynamic particularly challenging to identify is its veneer of care. Unlike overt criticism, their discouragement feels like legitimate concern. It seems to come from someone who wants to protect you from failure or disappointment. Yet after these interactions, your enthusiasm wanes, replaced by hesitation and uncertainty you didn't feel before. Jung recognized that unconscious emotions find indirect expression, often through behaviors that appear rational on the surface. In Psychological Types, he explored how our unconscious attitudes shape our ostensibly objective perspectives. The covert saboteur's jealousy operates through this mechanism. Rather than acknowledging their envy of your courage, potential, forward momentum, they channel it into protective behaviors that actually serve to keep you from outshining them. At the heart of this dynamic lies what Jung called the inferior function, the least developed aspect of our psychological makeup that often operates unconsciously and primitively. The covert saboteur may present as logical and measured, but their discouragement springs from undeveloped emotional content they haven't integrated. Envy of your possibilities, fear that your growth will leave them behind, resentment of your courage to risk what they cannot. They've developed a sophisticated psychological defense against acknowledging these uncomfortable feelings. By casting themselves as wise counselors concerned for your welfare, they transform their jealousy into a socially acceptable form, even one that might earn them gratitude for their insight. This rationalization allows them to undermine you while maintaining their self-image as helpful and caring. Over time, their seemingly well-intentioned warnings seep into your thought patterns through what Jung would call psychic contagion, the unconscious transmission of psychological content from one person to another. You begin anticipating potential failures, questioning your capabilities, seeing obstacles where you once saw opportunities. Their doubt becomes your doubt, their fear your fear, as their unconscious content infiltrates your psychological boundaries. To protect yourself, practice the Jungian term amplification, the conscious examination and elaboration of symbolic content to reveal its deeper meaning. When faced with their discouragement, amplify your awareness by asking, is this insight based on legitimate concerns, or is it creating unnecessary doubt? Does this guidance empower me to proceed wisely, or does it simply stop me from proceeding at all? This discernment allows you to filter valuable feedback from unconscious sabotage. Jung would likely recommend paying particular attention to your bodily responses during these interactions. Does their advice leave you feeling energized and thoughtfully cautious, or depleted and unnecessarily hesitant? The body often registers unconscious dynamics before the mind can articulate them. These somatic signals can serve as early warning systems for when ostensible support actually functions as subtle sabotage. Number 2, the emotional dependent. The emotional dependent expresses their jealousy through excessive need and possessiveness. They respond to your independence with emotional distress signals, frequent check-ins when you're with others, sullen withdrawal when you pursue personal interests. Statements like, I guess I'm just not important to you anymore, when you establish boundaries. Their love feels contingent on your constant reassurance and availability. Initially, their attachment might seem flattering, evidence of how deeply they care, how central you are to their world. But over time, a troubling pattern emerges. Any movement toward autonomy triggers their anxiety and resentment. Your other relationships, personal pursuits, and independent decisions become sources of tension rather than aspects of your identity they celebrate. This dynamic exemplifies what Jung identified as an undifferentiated emotional state, where boundaries between self and other remain psychologically blurred. In the development of personality, Jung explored how proper individuation requires establishing a clear sense of self distinct from others. The emotional dependent hasn't completed this developmental task. Instead, they experience your separateness as abandonment because they haven't developed a secure internal foundation. Jung described this pattern as participation mystique, a term borrowed from anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl, referring to a primitive psychological state where clear boundaries between subjects don't exist. The emotional dependent remains in this state in relation to you, experiencing your separate activities, relationships, and interests as threats to the merged identity they unconsciously seek to maintain. Their jealousy manifests not through competition or sabotage, but through emotional absorption. They don't want to outdo you or undermine you. They want to merge with you. Your separate existence feels threatening to their psychological stability. Their unconscious reasoning follows a primitive logic. If you exist apart from me, you might leave me. If you might leave me, I am not safe. This creates what Jung would identify as a regressive pull in the relationship, a gravity that draws both parties toward less differentiated, more infantile states of emotional functioning. Their distress at your independence activates guilt, obligation, and rescuing impulses. This pulls you back into patterns of reassurance and accommodation. These patterns gradually erode your personal freedom and authentic self-expression. Over time, you might find yourself making decisions based on anticipated emotional fallout rather than personal truth, canceling plans with friends to avoid their withdrawal, hesitating to pursue opportunities that would require time apart, filtering your experiences to emphasize connection and minimize separation. Their emotional reactions create an invisible fence around your autonomy. To maintain healthy boundaries while in relationship with an emotional dependent, practice what Jung calls conscious differentiation of the self. This involves clearly distinguishing between their emotional reactions and your responsibility. Their discomfort with your independence belongs to their psychological work, not yours. You can acknowledge their feelings with compassion while continuing to honor your separate selfhood. I understand you feel anxious when I'm not available, but having other relationships and interests is important for my well-being. Jung would likely emphasize that true relationship requires two distinct individuals. By maintaining appropriate differentiation, you actually create the possibility of authentic connection rather than mere enmeshment. Compassionate detachment, rather than either endless accommodation or complete withdrawal, offers the most balanced response to their unconscious jealousy. Number 1. The virtuous judge. The virtuous judge cloaks their jealousy in moral superiority. When you experience success or joy, they respond with ethical critiques. Aren't you concerned about becoming too materialistic with that promotion? You seem very focused on yourself lately. Remember, there's more to life than personal achievement. They position themselves as spiritually evolved, ethically rigorous, above petty emotions like envy, while simultaneously making you feel shallow or selfish for your accomplishments and pleasures. What makes this dynamic particularly perplexing is how it targets your values rather than just your achievements. Unlike the shadow projector, who diminishes your success, or the comparative rival who tries to outdo you, the virtuous judge questions your character and priorities. Their judgment creates not just doubt about what you've accomplished, but who you are becoming, striking at your moral identity rather than just your actions or abilities. This pattern illustrates what Jung called inflation, when an individual unconsciously identifies with archetypal content to elevate themselves above ordinary human experiences. In two essays on analytical psychology, Jung explored how people often identify with the persona, the social mask, or a particular archetypal energy to avoid confronting their shadow. The virtuous judge has identified with archetypal figures like the sage, the saint, the moral authority, using this identification to deny their very human jealousy. Jung wrote extensively about how the ego often identifies with elevated spiritual or ethical positions to defend against acknowledging less noble emotional responses. The virtuous judge cannot admit their envy directly, as it would contradict their self-image as being above such base emotions. Instead, they transform it into moral judgment, positioning themselves as spiritually or ethically superior to mask their unconscious resentment of your joy or success. Their critique often contains kernels of legitimate wisdom about materialism, ego, or ethical concerns, making it particularly difficult to recognize as jealousy in disguise. They may quote philosophical traditions, spiritual texts, or ethical frameworks. This gives their projections the weight of established wisdom. This intellectualization serves as sophisticated psychological armor, protecting them from confronting their own envy. The danger in this dynamic lies in how it creates internal conflict. Their judgments activate your own uncertainties about success, pleasure, and self-focus. You begin questioning not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it. You examine your motives through their critical lens. This scrutiny can disconnect you from authentic joy and accomplishment, replacing celebration with doubt about your moral compass. To maintain psychological integrity around a virtuous judge, practice what Jung calls shadow integration. This involves recognizing that their judgments likely activate areas where you hold your own unacknowledged doubts. Does part of me fear becoming too materialistic? Do I have concerns about the balance of self-focus in my life? By consciously exploring these questions rather than being unconsciously controlled by them, you reclaim authority over your own ethical framework. You can discern which concerns reflect your authentic values and which come from internalized judgments or social conditioning. This integration allows you to incorporate useful perspective while rejecting the unconscious jealousy it might carry. Jung suggests paying attention to the emotional tone underlying their moral pronouncements. True wisdom tends to liberate rather than diminish. It expands possibility rather than contracts it. If their guidance consistently leaves you feeling smaller, less worthy, or more constrained, it likely carries the shadow of envy beneath its virtuous exterior. The path to consciousness. These 5 patterns, the shadow projector, the comparative rival, the covert saboteur, the emotional dependent, and the virtuous judge, represent different manifestations of unconscious jealousy. They don't operate through open hostility, but through subtle psychological dynamics that can be difficult to identify and navigate precisely because they remain largely unconscious to both parties involved. Jung's framework offers us something more valuable than simple avoidance strategies. His central insight provides both explanation and remedy. What remains unconscious controls us. What becomes conscious can be integrated. By recognizing these patterns, both in others and potentially in ourselves, we create the possibility of transformation. For relationships where these dynamics operate, awareness alone shifts the interaction. Once you recognize projection, archetypal possession, or shadow content at work, you can choose your response consciously rather than reacting from entanglement. You can maintain compassion for the unconscious struggle these patterns represent in the other person, while establishing internal boundaries that protect your psychological integrity. This awareness doesn't necessarily require ending relationships. Sometimes understanding the dynamic is enough to create healthy distance while maintaining connection. In other cases, naming the pattern openly, with compassion rather than accusation, can invite the other person into greater consciousness if they're willing to engage with their own shadow content. Jung's psychology ultimately offers a compassionate perspective on jealousy and the damage it can cause. These patterns don't make someone a bad person to be avoided at all costs. They reflect unintegrated aspects of the psyche that all humans struggle with to varying degrees. The difference lies in who has begun the work of integration, who has started making the unconscious conscious. As you reflect on these patterns, consider both where you've encountered them in others and how they might manifest in your own behavior. Most of us have experienced moments of each type, times when we've projected our insecurities, engaged in comparison, subtly undermined others, clung too tightly, judged what we secretly desired. True psychological maturity comes not from avoiding these impulses, but from recognizing them as they arise. Jung believed that our most challenging relationships often offer our greatest opportunities for growth as they reveal the shadows we most need to integrate. Through conscious engagement with these dynamics, whether they originate in others or ourselves, we move toward what Jung called individualization, the process of becoming more fully ourselves, more wholly conscious, more authentically connected. In making the unconscious conscious, we transform what once controlled us into potential for growth. This awareness doesn't eliminate jealousy as a human emotion, but it changes our relationship to it, allowing us to experience it consciously rather than acting it out unconsciously. In this transformation lies the freedom Jung promised, not freedom from difficult emotions, but freedom from being unwittingly controlled by them. If you've come this far, you've demonstrated a commitment to understanding the complex psychological dynamics that shape our relationships. What unconscious pattern resonated most with you? Which jealous type have you encountered in your own life? Share your insights in the comments below. Let's continue Jung's work together, one comment at a time.